Apple is one of America's and probably the world's favorite companies. There's no doubt that the public, both in the USA and around the world, absolutely loves the company and its many groundbreaking products. And while Apple is an American company, they do most of their production in China. Indeed, when you see designed in California, made in China on the back of an Apple product, this might even undersell just how dependent the company is on its Chinese partnerships in order to make their product so widely available and their business so profitable. So, in order to figure out what's going on with Apple's factories in China, we probably ought to look at a few things. What does an Apple factory in China look like? How they got there? And what sort of problems there are in the system. What does an Apple factory in China look like? One factory owned and operated by Foxconn builds about half of all the world's iPhones. This means that this factory pumps out about 350 iPhones every single minute of every single day. In order to do this, the company that runs Apple's factory, Foxconn, has to continually hire new workers from across China, pulling on the country's massive population to keep people working in the high-turnover assembly line positions. And unlike many American factories that you've probably seen on the news or on our video on Tesla's factory in China, these factories still use a huge amount of human labor on the assembly line. In fact, unlike in a modern American factory where most of the parts are assembled by machines, in Apple's factories, people still do most of the work of actually putting together Apple's products. This means that most workers in Apple's factories will be working the same spot on an assembly line, doing the exact same thing thousands and thousands of times every single day. And while this isn't all bad, production in China helps to lift thousands of people out of poverty every year. These jobs are often hard or boring enough that people don't stay very long. Thus, Foxconn is continuously hiring new employees to replace people who have worked there for a few years and are ready to move on. For many workers in these factories, this is exactly what they came to do: work, save money, and then eventually quit. Workers normally live in dorms or tenements associated with the factory, usually with about 8 people per room, although this used to be up to 12. And they'll eat at company cafeterias for lunch and get other meals at local street vendors or restaurants. We might think about these factories like an old-fashioned company town in the United States. What this means is that because so many workers have flocked to the iPhone factories in order to make a living and send money to their rural communities, so have small business owners and aspiring capitalists looking to make the most out of this situation. Longhua Town in Shenzhen Province hosts hundreds of thousands of employees, which has led to a massive ecosystem of businesses around the area, all looking to supply workers with food, goods, and entertainment. And like in any company town, there is one explicit purpose for its existence: to work. So, many of the people who work in Apple's Chinese factories end up working almost the entire time they're there, clocking an extra 2 to 4 hours of overtime every day in order to maximize their take-home at the end of the month. Most workers take home a base pay of around $300 per month, with the potential to make over $600 per month in overtime and over $700 for workers willing to do that overtime as part of the night shift. And while the cost of living is lower in China, it has risen steadily for the past few decades, and we shouldn't underestimate how much it really costs. Indeed, most of the workers in Apple's factories actually need to work overtime in order to make a livable wage in the province they work in. But before we dive into the issues and controversies surrounding Apple's Chinese factories, we probably ought to examine exactly how Apple got so deeply embedded in China. How did Apple get so embedded in China? In understanding the global economic forces that brought Apple to China, the first thing that comes up: follow the money. Apple and Foxconn both get millions of dollars of tax breaks from the government in Shenzhen, and Apple has accepted plenty of other benefits from free housing to free promotion of their recruitment campaigns. With that being said, it's not just massive tax breaks because, in all likelihood, like what we saw with the bid for the new Amazon headquarters, Apple could get similar tax breaks anywhere. No, China, in many ways, is the only place Apple could make these products as efficiently and as cost-effectively as they do now. China, unlike any other country except perhaps India, has an absolutely massive population. Indeed, it's the most populous country in the world. This population, unlike other potential competitors, can provide Apple and Foxconn with a blend of both skilled and unskilled labor at very low costs in a country that already has all the infrastructure in place to be a massive manufacturing center. Apple got into business in China back in 2001, and the entrance was spearheaded by the company's now CEO, Tim Cook. When Apple's new line of products, the iPod and the iPhone, proved to be more popular than anyone could have expected, Apple, Foxconn, and the Chinese government all had to scramble to meet the demand. Very quickly, Apple became one of Foxconn's biggest contracts. Foxconn, because one of China's biggest employers, and China became the biggest player in Apple's production lines. And during this period, people in China were buying iPhones left and right, and Apple was happy to turn a tidy profit on these new phones and on their cheap manufacturing in China. But since then, Apple has had a few hiccups. Indeed, the Chinese economy is in a very different position than it was in 2001, and many domestic companies like Huawei have gained traction in the Chinese market at the expense of Apple's phones. One estimate puts Apple down 5% market share since their peak in 2015, and while other companies have changed their production and moved to a more international model, or simply moved some production to countries like South Korea, Vietnam, or India, Apple's efforts to make similar moves have largely failed. Apple, in spite of a few moves like producing AirPods in Vietnam or opening a factory in India, has largely stayed in China, in large part because Apple can't afford to leave, and neither China nor Foxconn wants them to. Indeed, Apple has perhaps permanently invested itself deeply in its Chinese manufacturing centers. What are the problems with Apple's factories in China? So, we've already seen that many workers in Apple's Chinese factories are living in squalid conditions, making just enough to live over their local poverty line. Indeed, not many Americans would consider living with 7 roommates to be very worth any job, especially one that is so boring that workers are known to fall asleep at their posts. But Apple's factories in China have other issues as well. We've already discussed the near-mandatory overtime that many workers clock, often cutting into the time they would otherwise be sleeping. There's also the issue of worker turnover. One might imagine that any job where people only work a year or two at most is not a pleasant job. But the sad truth is that many of Foxconn's employees don't make it that long. Although exact statistics on the issue are hard to get a hold of, it's widely reported that many workers tragically take their own lives while working at Foxconn factories for Apple. In one incident from 2012, 150 workers threatened to jump from the roof of a factory in protest of their working conditions. And though Apple claims that they hold their suppliers up to the strictest labor standards, they have been caught in a lie before. Indeed, in 2020, one report found that Apple was knowingly violating Chinese labor laws concerning temporary workers in a factory. The investigation found that Apple, via Foxconn, was employing nearly 3 times the maximum number of temporary workers in violation of Chinese labor standards. And for Apple, while technically these are Foxconn factories rather than Apple plants, it's hard to believe that Apple doesn't know what's going on in their factories. If the free press is able to see what goes on inside these buildings, Apple certainly does as well.